Welcome, everybody. I'm Bobby Ross, columnist for Religion Unplugged and editor of the Christian Chronicle. I'm really excited today to be joined by four leading religion journalists to talk about a big news event this week. We had a pretty major Supreme Court decision regarding the LGBT hiring with some religious ramifications. And so maybe we'll start with Kelsey and just everybody tell us a little bit about who's on the panel, and then we'll just dive into some of the questions.
Great, thanks, Bobby. I'm Kelsey Dallas. I'm based in Utah and cover religion news for the Deseret News.
Great.
I'm Daniel Silliman. I'm in East Tennessee, and I am the news editor for Christianity Today.
I'm Elana Schor. I'm actually in DC this week reporting for the Associated Press, where I cover religion and politics.
Great.
I'm Bob Smietana. I'm the editor-in-chief of Religion News Service, and I'm also in Tennessee, just south of Nashville.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all again for being here. The Supreme Court decision on Monday, I know at least one of you, Kelsey, was surprised by this decision. What can y'all tell me about, I guess, what the basic gist of what was decided and why it might have been surprising?
Well, I can jump in since you called me out for my surprise. Basically, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that prohibitions on sex discrimination in hiring and employment would also outlaw discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. So that means gay and transgender workers are now protected in the workplace. The reason I was so surprised is that during oral arguments, the conservative justices were very concerned about whether such a ruling was sort of appropriate for the Supreme Court, that it might cause a lot of mass upheaval. And even Chief Justice John Roberts, who's sort of a swing vote, he doesn't like traditionally causing that type of chaos. So I just thought they'd try to find sort of a more subtle way to weigh in on this conversation.
Well, were the rest of you surprised, or kind of what was your reaction to the decision that was made 6-3?
I will say I was also surprised, particularly that Gorsuch wrote this opinion, which has been the subject, obviously, of much back and forth in faith communities as well as, broader political discussions. As we'll discuss later, faith issues remained a little bit unresolved, but it was a pretty clear statement from a justice who conservatives really applauded when he was nominated that aggravated a lot of conservatives.
Okay.
I'm on the other side. I'm completely not surprised. I think this is what judges have thought for a long time. It's funny, I was at the Jay Sekulow, who's the conservative legal scholar, advisor to the president. He gave us a talk at the National Religious Broadcasters in 2014, I believe. But in 2015, when they were talking about the cake baking things, and he basically said you should bake the cake. That every judge out there sees LGBT discrimination as equivalent to race, and it's already lost. And so, if you're going to have a lawsuit about this, it has to be something beyond generic LGBT discrimination, because no judge will side with you. And I think Sekulow can read the wind, and I think he was right on that.
Another reason maybe not to be surprised is it's 2020, and this is the year where everything is upside down and different, and we should, be on our guard about our expectations a little bit. I was interested, though, on the point about Gorsuch, when I looked back at my own reporting and a lot of other people's reportings in October when they argued the case, how often it came up that so many of the arguments seemed aimed at Gorsuch and his judicial philosophy. And so even though I wasn't expecting that necessarily on Monday when it came in, it did correspond to a lot of the reporting that I feel like religion reporters in particular had done when thinking about the religious exemption issues in this case.
Okay. And moving right to that issue of religion and religious exemptions, maybe somebody who's smarter than I am, tell us what religious exemptions are in this context, and then maybe kind of how that whole issue is playing out or may play out now that the court has made this decision related to LGBT rights.
Well, I can address how the opinion comment on it. Although let's
Okay.
be clear, in my case, I was unfortunately not reporting on the arguments in October, but I did report yesterday on how religious freedom lawyers are addressing the opinion, and namely the opinion clearly states, written by Gorsuch, that the questions of the scope of potential religious exemptions to this could be settled in future cases.
Mm-hmm.
It notably leaves the door open for a couple of different avenues for a faith-based exemption. The first is the Federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which sets up a scrutiny-based test when determining whether people of faith are having their right to exercise that faith infringed upon by a government edict. And the second is, he also says, there could be a question of whether there's a religious exemption to Title VII at all, but that the language on that in the opinion is a little less clear. And that he said, even when this law was being written, people knew that it could infringe upon questions of faith. So let's put those aside, because none of the plaintiffs in this case actually asserted a religious liberty claim, which is notable here. The court just simply didn't address it. So those are, at least lawyers told me, that the two biggest potential paths to future faith-based exemptions.
Yeah, the Title VII, I wanted to note, that's that federal law that this case dealt with. It includes a religious exemption that is meant to cover sort of a wide variety of religious institutions. In the reporting I had done leading up to oral arguments, it was clear that a lot of faith-based schools and other religious businesses are a little worried about whether that exemption will hold up in court. There's conflict about whether, for example, a school is allowed to hire only Catholics, but can they make sure that the Catholic is Catholic in the sense that they want them to be, that you also believe that you shouldn't use birth control or that you shouldn't be in a same-sex marriage. And so there's just a lot of gray area around how that exemption can be applied. And so that's why I think, as Elana noted, it's important that Gorsuch was saying there are other tools like the Religious Freedom Restoration Act that can protect people too.
Okay.
And it would have been strange for them to settle the religious exemption issue in this case, since none of the plaintiffs brought that up. It would have been the judges saying, oh, and also another thing. I mean, one of them was a skydiving instructor. Gerald Bostock worked for the county government, and the funeral home in Michigan was not a religious institution. So in some ways, it's to be expected that this employment law case would interest religious people, but it can't answer the religious question.
Okay. I know there's a case, I think Kelsey has written about it, others of you may have as well, with Philadelphia Catholic Charities getting into whether faith-based groups, whether they can require husband, wife, parents, or whether they have to provide services to all same-sex couples and others. Kelsey, in particular, since I know you've written about that, do you anticipate that case getting into that issue and settling any of these questions, or is this something that's probably going to take a while in the courts to come to any kind of clear answer?
Well, it will be relevant in the sense that adoption case could end up overturning this controversial ruling from the 1990s that sort of weakened how a person of faith can use the First Amendment's protection for the free exercise clause. It sort of weakened how they can use it in the court in terms of demanding a religious exemption from a non-discrimination law. So basically, if the court were to overturn that rule in favor of faith-based adoption agencies, it would at least become easier to make a case in front of a court that as a religious person, you deserve the right to sort of avoid some of these laws that might cause you to violate your beliefs.
Okay.
Yeah, to Kelsey's point, every lawyer I spoke with for my story this week said what we're really hoping for is a very favorable ruling on that 30-year-old law. That's their number one goal, right? And if they don't, then they're looking at other ways in to chip away a little bit at the effects with other cases.
You're talking about Religious Freedom Restoration Act, something, or am I?
Sort of. It was the free exercise clause, but then RFRA was trying to band-aid over that really people were mad about. So it's basically saying it has to do with the free exercise clause of the First Amendment.
Okay.
You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought the funeral home case had early on had religious overtones. That the reason the person was fired, the employee was fired because the owner's a devout Christian, wants to run by Christian businesses, and he won early on and then lost after that. So that was part of it was sort of the Hobby Lobby angle of, we're not a religious institution, but we're run religious principles, and so it has a little bit to do. It wasn't a central rule in the case, but there's that angle on this.
Yeah, they had made this religious claim and then dropped it when they appealed to the Supreme Court, because it didn't seem like it was getting them very far.
And it is when employment law intersects with religious employers, it is most often the case that it's not, the minister of a church. There's all these marginal cases where it's like, is it a secular business or is it religious? And in this case, the religion of a funeral home wasn't the driving issue, but it maybe will well be an employee like that who brings this issue to the court the next time.
Well, I guess this was a 6-3 decision, and we keep hearing about a 5-4 conservative split. And I guess 2 of the so-called conservatives were a part of the majority with the more liberal members. What do you read into that? And then since this ruling, I've seen various stories about Christian conservatives rattled by the decision, and some concern about the future of religious freedom. Where do y'all see? I guess maybe there's a question in there somewhere, but what would your analysis be of all of that?
Well, I just want to start by saying this ruling reminded me that sort of an ideological conservative or liberal is not the same as a political conservative or liberal. And many court watchers are sort of guilty of assuming our political debates perfectly map on to the Supreme Court's approach to their work.
Okay.
I'll totally agree with what Kelsey just said, and also add that I, as somebody with roots in Congress, was really fascinated by a speech that Senator Josh Hawley, who's a former clerk for Chief Justice Roberts, gave yesterday, where he, in pretty blistering fashion said that, there was this bargain that religious conservatives struck. We don't always agree with the political establishment on issues of trade, on issues of taxes, et cetera, but we tend to stay in the fold because of judges. So this decision is clearly making one prominent Republican senator question what he describes as that bargain. So I, for one, will be really interested to hear whether others follow him in this and start suddenly decoupling what it means to be a religious conservative from what it means to be an establishment conservative. It'll be fascinating.
Wow, it will be.
Interesting thing. I thought I saw Ralph Reed somewhere saying homosexuality wasn't a big issue for the religious right, and sort of downplaying this. There's a little bit of revisionist history going on, at least with some of the activists, to say, well, we didn't really care about that. And this might be actually true. I've thought for a long time that's if you're a religious institution like the Southern Baptist Convention or a college, you might think it, but that this was not it's become less and less of a driving issue for religious conservatives, the way it was 20 years ago, say. I would say probably Ralph Reed in the 80s would have said something different, I suspect.
I do know in 2016, there was some polling that showed that, for instance, with white evangelicals, the number one issue in their vote was national security. So we do often take explicitly religious issues that are relevant to religious people as the most relevant to religious people, but they, also pay taxes and fight wars and are concerned about all those other things. So I'm sure this will matter in the upcoming election, and I'm sure this will feature in, but it's June. It's a long time until the election, and it's just one issue. So I'm not convinced it'll be the kind of tipping point that it can seem right now.
Well, and Bobby, as you mentioned sort of what to expect in the future, I think a few months from now, maybe even by July, when we have the rest of the rulings from this term, it might be clear that Gorsuch is, for the most part, exactly who conservative voters thought he would be that he sort of will have these opinions that were more what was expected of him, because there are still other high profile rulings coming, including religion related ones.
To just play a little bit of devil's advocate on whether it'll matter, and if I was going to make the case that it really would matter, I would say this is an administration that has repeatedly emphasized religious liberty, oftentimes in the same breath as its record on abortion. And it's true that some of the big religious freedom questions, frankly, weren't addressed in this ruling, but that does not take away the alarm and concern among a lot of prominent religious conservatives. They feel like their religious liberty is being trampled upon. So at a time when Trump really needs those voters to turn out, and he's been appealing to them with this issue, I think how the re-election campaign handles that messaging going forward could make the difference in terms of whether this really matters or not.
And if it matters, it would most likely be in terms of sort of enthusiasm, right? It's am I 110% voting this way, or am I only 90% voting this way?
Well, something I've been thinking about too is whether being in favor of LGBT rights has to be seen as some sort of swipe against religion or swipe against religious freedom. I think some people approach it and say those two things interact with each other regularly, but it's possible to advance LGBT rights while at the same time adjusting and advancing religious freedom. But some of the reactions Monday from people of faith was just outraged that our laws would sort of acknowledge same-sex marriage or transgenderism, because they believe that those things are sort of sinful and should not be protected by the U.S. law in any way.
I remember.
On the other hand, the outcry here is so much quieter than it was for same-sex marriage. The Obergefell ruling was, doom and gloom and the end of the world for certain religious groups. Not for every lots of religious groups were certainly happy about it, but the folks who opposed the religious opponents were up in arms, and this was the big news of the day. And the ruling was big, but it wasn't as huge as it was back then.
And some of that is probably because it doesn't address the religious exemption, and it does kick the can down the road, and it does separate the question of, I certainly am hearing from sources concern about sexual orientation or gender identity being written into the law through the courts as a category, but that's a separate and much more technical issue than, can a Christian college require someone affirm certain beliefs in order to work there? And that's still an open question.
And I guess I've read some analysis kind of about saying maybe this is the court's version of a Utah compromise, and we're going to strongly affirm LGBT rights at the same time we strongly affirm religious liberty. Do y'all have indications that might be what's occurring, or is it just kind of waiting to see what the court's actually going to say when they rule on the next cases?
I think some of the people I talked to absolutely thinks that'll be what happens, is that we'll gradually sort of strengthen LGBT rights, but at the same time have some important rulings in favor of people of faith. But the other thing I've heard from sources is that you really need to be careful in terms of betting on what the court will do. It's basically impossible to predict the future. And again, it's like Monday was a surprise to me. Any of these future rulings could be surprising too.
I hope you didn't have money on Monday.
I know.
We published a opinion piece today from Daniel Bennett, who's a professor at John Brown University, sort of making the argument that this is the court's version at a Utah compromise and sort of striking some kind of balance, specifically looking at the really strong record that this court and the court in recent history has had at defending religious liberty cases, from Hosanna Tabor to the Hobby Lobby case, and there's just a pretty strong track record in recent years. So I found that analysis pretty persuasive. I think he makes a pretty good argument. Though I know of presidents of Christian colleges, they're just saying, well, but I don't want to be the test case, right? I don't want to be the lawsuit that even if we win, it's too risky in a kind of personal way.
And aren't the university's already under pressure on Title IX and with the NCAA and all that, so maybe facing pressure on a lot of fronts.
And just financially, they don't want to pay lots of lawyers for lots of years to fight something.
Right.
There were, before Trump was elected, I spoke to a number of conservative legal folks, but just regular people who do like church law or law for religious groups, who were really terrified that they would be on the wrong side of a kind of Bob Jones situation, that eventually they were afraid for Obama that he would make link federal aid for students to LGBT non-discrimination. So there's probably this ruling, one thing it does is moves all those groups who oppose LGBT inclusion into the same camp that Bob Jones was in at the beginning of it, because Bob Jones opposed Bob Jones was segregationist, and they lost their tax exemption and lost money because they were on the wrong side of the law when it came to discrimination. So now all these other groups where it's perfectly acceptable for them to and legal for them to discriminate based on sexuality are now in the same boat or the same kind of position that Bob Jones was in. So it'll be interesting to see what will happen with that.
I'll also, frankly, be interested to see what happens legislatively, because you had Congressman Chris Stewart from Utah propose legislation last year that attempted to kind of do a little bit of what Kelsey was referring to in terms of bridging a gap, and a lot of LGBT groups and civil rights groups kind of dismiss it out of hand. And now there seems even less reason for that to have any legislative momentum. Then you have the Equality Act, which Biden is really championing, as the entire Democratic Party, which provides pretty expansive protections. So this could actually be resolved by Congress under a Biden administration if Biden wins. We never really know.
I just wrapped up and filed a story about that Equality Act and then the Fairness for All Act, sort of thinking about what's next. And what's interesting is that because of this ruling on Monday, now a lot of what the Equality Act hopes to do can be possible through the courts. So if you just sort of take this broad definition of sex discrimination and apply it to every reference to sex discrimination in statutes, it's like, okay, we get pretty close to being what the Equality Act is chasing. And that's where I totally agree with you, Elana. That's sort of like, well, what happens to the Fairness for All Act? Who's interested in that? Who's talking about it? Where some folks see an opportunity for good conversation still is that we still need to talk about places of public accommodation. So things like a wedding cake shop. There is no ban on sex discrimination in those laws. And so we do need to have some sort of legislative conversation about how to work out that conflict. And a lot of that Fairness for All coalition is hopeful that we can sort of have a dialogue around these issues instead of just using the more blunt instrument of the court.
Well, I appreciate all of you. We've got a couple of minutes left. Anything I didn't ask or great insight that you really would like to share since I'm recording this?
I wanted to add that everyone should be watching for the court's decision sometime this month, maybe the beginning of July, in this case about Catholic schools and their hiring decisions, because it is possible that the court will sort of empower religious institutions to say which employees enjoy sort of a protected status and don't have to fall under these non-discrimination laws. So that's way oversimplifying what's going on. But basically, as soon as a week or two from now, the court could give some power back to places like faith-based schools and say, we want you to still be very much in control of who you're hiring and firing.
I'm sure you do, Kelsey, but do you know the name of that case?
Lady of Guadalupe Schools versus somebody. Sorry.
No,
Yeah,
that's
Lady of Guadalupe case. Yeah,
that's good.
Yeah,
that's
you
good.
might be reading about that in a few minutes in RNS, which was in the works before we were in this thing. So I'm not stealing your idea.
Get on it, Kelsey. You have a couple minutes to scoop him.
I'll just tweet out my other story.
Okay. Well, thank y'all so much. I really appreciate it.
Great,
Thank you.
Thanks, Bobby.
Thanks. This was great.